So today I want to talk about survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is a type of selection bias, and it's a logical error in which, in selecting for a certain population or group in data and statistical analysis, one might overlook certain sample sets because they are not visible and thus skew the data. So this often occurs in situations where somebody has died, or a group of population of people have died rather, and or a situation where a company no longer exists, and you ignore those data points, creating a much more optimistic outlook for a specific group of people or a specific set of things. And I want to talk about this because conservatives and wealthy people often use this exact same bias to entrench their positions that they have deserved their wealth. And I think it's an important tool to be able to call it what it is and disarm it. So, for example, when a wealthy person has achieved the American dream and has made it, and they've, have the perception that they have worked hard and achieved greatness, there is a false perception from the bias of the people around them that everyone there worked hard and therefore made it. However, it ignores the statistics, and it's very easy to dismiss the statistics of just how many people work truly hard and fail, especially when the overwhelming majority of people who do attempt to succeed and become wealthy and work very, very hard end up failing in the process for reasons that are outside of the scope of the person. This could be anything ranging from systemic racism to a tragic accident in a person's life, to, having a sick family member that needs to be taken care of. These are small little data points that are often ignored because anyone who didn't make it must not have worked hard enough, because the people who all worked hard clearly made it. And so this type of bias is one that's actually really important to examine. And I wanted to give a few more examples so that it's easier for people to, one, understand it, and two, point it out when it occurs, especially in conservative data, because it often happens in conservative data points. So one example that I want to talk about is from World War I. So at the beginning of the First World War, the uniform of the British soldiers included a brown cloth cap. They were not provided with metal helmets. As the war went on, the Army authorities and the War Office became alarmed at the high proportion of men suffering head injuries. They therefore decided to replace the cloth headgear with metal helmets. From then on, all the soldiers wore the metal helmets. However, the War Office was amazed to discover that the incidence of head injuries then increased. It can be assumed that the intensity of fighting was the same before and after this changed. So then why would the recorded number of head injuries per battalion have increased when men wore metal helmets rather than cloth caps? Now I'm going to give you a minute if you want to quickly pause the video right here and take a look and think about it yourself before you listen to my answer. That'd be awesome. But what the solution actually is to this seeming contradiction of information, assuming that the metal helmets should have prevented injuries, is not something wrong with the metal helmets at all, and it's certainly not that the helmets actually increase head injuries. The reason for this is that the people wearing the brown cloth caps were dying. So the statistical data was only looking at survivors. It was not looking at people who had perished with the brown caps. So those people who would have died having worn brown caps now had injuries when they had metal helmets. So all it was a shift in data points from death to injuries, which would obviously be a net plus, a net gain. So this is the type of situation that we're looking at, where one group of data seems to suggest something very weird or very obvious depending on the situation, and it's because we are not looking at a certain set of sample data that's been removed because they were not living to be sampled. And again, with the brown caps, those people died, and therefore they were not looked at the list of survivors, aka people with head injuries. Another example comes from World War II. And these model data points are all hypothetical, but the actual story is real. There was a statistician that looked at a set of points where bullets were hitting a plane in World War II. And when the US Army looked at this model, they came to one set of conclusions, and the statistician came to a very different set of data. And I'll explain it to you, and let's see if you can kind of parse through the details and figure out what the story behind it is. So, if you look at this model, these are bullet holes in a plane. And when they looked at this, they were trying to decide where should we put armor on this plane to shore up its survival. The obvious answer that the military went with is, well, we're seeing all these red dots. There's plenty of bullet holes there. We should probably shore up those spots. However, this statistician looked at this plot of data and realized that this was a sample of survivorship bias. The parts of the plane not getting shot, these spots that are in white on there, are the spots where planes didn't come back from. And this kind of thing happens a lot when you're analyzing data, often removing entire sets of people or objects in order to create this bias to a certain set of outcomes. Again, in this case, the plane should have been armored in the spots that were not hit by bullets, because the plane survived the spots where they were hit with bullets. And so it's obvious that the military could have assumed that and made a really grave mistake that would have cost a lot of people lives. But this statistician actually saved lives in this situation. So another example, just briefly, that is noted is called the caveman effect. Basically, when we examine early prehistoric peoples, we can often find cave paintings that, were made thousands upon thousands of years ago. We can find situations where you have like little burial pits and fire pits in caves, but we can never find them anywhere else. And again, this is probably an example of survivorship bias, because we don't take into account that if paintings were made on trees or outdoors, they were probably washed away or were probably removed from weather and other factors. So oftentimes this type of selection bias can occur just within our, typical understanding of trying to examine something in history. We will never know the full extent of cave, or rather paintings, being drawn on trees, or fire pits, or burial grounds, because oftentimes they could have been washed away. Whereas in caves, they might have been well preserved for an extended period of time. There's also another example, just to briefly go over it, in epidemiology, where certain people who survived a certain disease, if you look at survival rates might not take into account people who died before procedures were done, because they died too quickly and were not calculated into survival rate calculations of a specific disease and certain treatments. So you get these little, moments and studies that even that are well designed and thought out, that can often miss entire populations that you don't want to see or that you overlook. And so having a knowledge of survivorship bias, I believe, is important, because it's also the type of thing that allows certain forms of capitalism and certain situations of companies surviving economic situations to appear better than they are. Failed companies don't often make it into performance studies, and therefore you can have a confirmation that all of the surviving businesses and industries and, economic, tools, that they all function well, when in fact there's a great number of businesses who shut down and were not taken into account. So you have these biases, especially in capitalism, especially in wealthy sectors, that want to promote certain narratives and either purposefully overlook or, in many occasions, honestly miss these other forms of information. And this creates a situation where correlation proves causality without actually taking into account any of the larger details, especially those who did not survive in the data points. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.